Hello, I'm Andrew McDiarmid. A number of books have had a big impact in history. The Iliad of Homer, the Gallic Wars of Caesar, the Annals of Tacitus, the plays of Euripides, even Plato's Republic. And then there are many influential modern classics as well. But there's one book that stands above others as foundational to Western civilization. It was critical to the development of Western conceptions of law, literature, medicine, science, and human rights. The people, places, and events recorded in this book have been of the utmost importance to human society and culture over the last 2,000 years. I'm speaking, of course, about the Bible. At the Discovery Institute, we believe that Western culture, conceived by the ancient Hebrews, Greeks, and Christians, and elaborated in the American founding, have encouraged creativity, enabled discovery, and upheld the uniqueness and dignity of human beings. Part of our mission is to defend and promote the Judeo-Christian values that undergird our religious, political, and economic liberty. Today, though, the Bible is under attack. It's being disregarded as historically inaccurate, primarily mythological, or even a work of propaganda. These views are held by the majority of modern scholars and by much of the general public. According to these views, the Bible is irrelevant to our world today, an interesting collection of fanciful tales, but nothing more. But what if that idea is wrong? What if there's ample evidence to suggest the Bible is an historically reliable text, a trustworthy source of history and wisdom? What if we could corroborate or verify the historicity and accuracy of the Bible? To probe these questions, I'm pleased to be speaking today with Dr. Titus Kennedy, a professional field archaeologist, adjunct professor at Biola University, and research fellow at Discovery Institute. Titus works primarily with sites and materials of the ancient Near East and Mediterranean world. He's been involved in archaeological projects at 18 sites, including directing and supervising multiple projects spanning the Bronze Age through the Byzantine period, and he has conducted artifact research at museums and collections around the world. He earned his doctorate from the University of South Africa, focused on archaeological demographics and the Late Bronze Age, master's degrees from University of Toronto and University of South Africa, and a BA from Biola University. Titus has been a consultant, writer, and guide for history and archaeology documentaries and curricula. He is author of 3 books on the archaeology of the Bible: Unearthing the Bible, Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, and his latest book, The Essential Archaeological Guide to Bible Lands. Titus, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Andrew. Good to be here.
Absolutely. Well, over a few different videos, I'd like to explore the research you present in your 3 books to help us address this central question. Can the Bible be viewed today as an historically reliable text? In short, can we trust it? This is a key question in any defense of Western culture and values. The evidence you document in your books suggests that we can confirm the historical accuracy of the Bible. So let's unpack some of your findings. In this part of our conversation, we'll focus on your first book, Unearthing the Bible, 101 Archaeological Discoveries that Bring the Bible to Life. And before we jump into the content of the book, I want to mention that the foreword was written by our very own philosopher of science, Dr. Stephen Meyer. In it, he relates his experience of a walking tour in the old city of Jerusalem in 1989. He got to see firsthand some of the bullae, or signet rings, of Judaite officials that have been preserved since the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 587 BC. The bullae bore the names of minor officials in the court of King Jehoiakim. Meyer writes that he was fascinated by the detailed extra-biblical corroboration of specific events and biblical figures. What was it that got you, Titus, into archaeology and made you decide to pursue it as a career?
I had always had an interest in history, even ancient history, during elementary school, and there were kind of 2 events that led me more directly into archaeology rather than history. The first of those was visiting an archaeological site with my family, and it was not just a site, but it was also a reconstruction of an ancient village. And so I got to see that there were actually remains from centuries ago that were still in existence, and people were uncovering these. And sometimes they were also rebuilding so that you could see what they looked like. The next thing was that one of my teachers gave me a book on the excavation of Troy by Heinrich Schliemann. And that was my intro into connecting historical texts with archaeological discoveries. And after reading that, I realized that we don't just get our historical information from old books or old manuscripts, that people actually go out and find these locations, the architecture, the artifacts, and they reconstitute history for us from the physical remains. As I continue to read, I was also given some books on archaeology connected to the Bible, and so I saw how that specifically was a subfield of archaeology, and I became very interested in that. Eventually, at the end of high school, I decided that I wanted to try to study archaeology and began to do that, and now here I am today.
Okay. Well, that must have been a thrill to discover that it's one thing to read about these things, but it's another to find objects and go to these places and really uncover aspects of the ancient past. Well, in Unearthing the Bible, you handpicked 101 archaeological discoveries important to the Hebrew Bible and the Christian New Testament, from Genesis all the way to the first century Christians and the early church. So let's start with the basics. What is an artifact in archaeological terms, and how do they help us learn about the ancient past?
A basic definition of an artifact is an object that has been modified by a human. And so this could encompass something like a tool or a weapon or an idol, an inscription, a coin, pottery. So many, many different things. It just has to be modified or created by a human.
And, seeing as you have come across many of these artifacts now, what is it that makes them so powerful to discover and behold? I mean, how do you encapsulate the experience you get when you come across something for the first time that you've learned about?
Well, from an experiential standpoint, when you're digging at a site and you uncover an artifact and you look at it, you're probably the first person to have seen that since its time of use, which could have been thousands of years ago in the case of some artifacts. But it gives us this window into the past, and we see what were people making, what was their technological skill, which was quite impressive often. What did people use these things for? And what kind of information can we gain from that? Because we may have an inscription that tells us about the dedication of a temple or a military campaign. We might have a coin that shows a ruler's face on it and his name and title. So it really gives us a lot of different types of information. If we collect many of these artifacts in the right historical context, we can understand the past, we can understand the history of that site and that culture much better.
Right. And the job of the archaeologist is obviously not just to excavate and discover, but also to analyze and compile and bring everything together to form a coherent narrative, if you will. Well, of the 101 artifacts you describe and beautifully picture in your book, we're going to zoom into just 5 or 10 today to give some idea of the scope and depth of the book. Let's start with the Stele of Hammurabi, a stele being a monument stone or commemorative tablet. What's the significance of this object, and what biblical information does it help to corroborate?
Well, this object is very, very famous. Today, the Stele of Hammurabi is sitting in the middle of the Louvre Museum in Paris, and it's known all over the world as one of the early law codes. Yes, there were definitely earlier law codes than the Code of Hammurabi, but it's one of the most famous early codes, and it was very, very extensive. Now, this was written down in the 18th century BC, so the 1700s BC, which is also the time of the Joseph story, the setting of the Joseph story. And we read in that story in the book of Genesis that Joseph is sold into slavery for 20 shekels of silver by his brother. And if we go to the Code of Hammurabi, which is contemporaneous with Joseph, we see that in 3 of the laws, it states the value of a slave as 20 shekels of silver. So we see that historical precision coming out. because the prices of slaves changed over time. It inflated as you went further on in time. And if you go back in time earlier, it was a lower price. So we see that the Joseph story has this particular place in time where it's set and it gets some of these precise details correct. It's relaying accurate information. Archaeology gives us a window into that. And additionally, there are other laws that are found on the Code of Hammurabi that also connect to many of the social customs that we see in the patriarchal narratives in Genesis.
Okay. A little piece of the puzzle, but important nevertheless. Well, next up is the Dream Stele, found between the paws of the Great Sphinx at Giza. Tell us how this discovery helps to corroborate the Pharaoh of the Exodus.
So this was made by a pharaoh named Thutmose IV. His father was Amenhotep II. And this stele talks about how when he was out hunting one afternoon, he laid down by the Sphinx to take a nap, and he had this dream. And in this dream, the god of the Sphinx came to him and made a deal with him. And his reward was going to be that the gods would make him the king of Egypt, the pharaoh. And so the implication here is that he's been given a divine blessing from the gods of Egypt that he'll become the next pharaoh, no matter what. Egyptologists typically understand this as Thutmose IV was not the intended heir to the throne. He had an older brother who disappeared, which we have evidence of that from Egyptian texts as well. But he is making it sound like this was the plan of the gods of Egypt all along for him to become the next king. Well, if we look at the Exodus story and we look at the biblical chronology, we see that his father would have been at the time of the Exodus. And there's that final plague, the death of the firstborn. Well, if his older brother died in the plagues there, that was the heir to the throne. But he's making it sound like this was the plan of the Egyptian gods all along. Everything's fine. He should be the heir to the throne now, even though he had an older brother.
Okay. Wow, very interesting find there. Well, what about the hieroglyphic inscriptions mentioning the lands of the Nomads of Yahweh, discovered on the walls of Egyptian temples and a temple pillar in Sudan? Do those help to corroborate the Israelites before they settled in Canaan?
They do, and this is very important because the wandering period, this wilderness wandering period, is one that's barely archaeologically attested. Now, we normally would not expect to have a lot of archaeological evidence of nomads in the wilderness, but we would hope for something. Well, what we have here are 2 Egyptian inscriptions at this temple of Soleb, and they talk about various groups and locations that the pharaoh has either conquered or subjugated. And the name of one of these groups is the Nomads of Yahweh. So they are nomadic people, wanderers, who are associated with Yahweh. Well, we know that Yahweh is only associated with the ancient Israelites. There are no other cultures or nations who worshiped Yahweh in ancient times. And so that connection is very strong here. We know that the Israelites were wandering at this time, and the geographic context of this inscription places them east of Egypt, somewhere in the Sinai or Transjordan, Edom area, which is just where they were right before going into the promised land of Canaan. So this looks like archaeological attestation, inscriptional attestation of the early Israelites.
Wow. And when were those discovered? Was that recently or?
This was discovered in the middle of the 20th century, but there really wasn't much publication on it for quite a while, and there were no pictures available until very recently.
Okay. Well, and then there's the curious case of Shechem, corroborated by the Amarna letters. Tell us what we can learn about them.
I think this is one of those cases where archaeology helps to fill in the gaps in the biblical record, or sort of in between the lines, for us to know what's going on. If you read through Joshua, you see that the Israelites pop up in Shechem twice, chapter 8 and then again in chapter 24. But there's no mention of attacking or conquering or subjugating that city anywhere in the book. And so you wonder, how did they get there? What was the process? Because they're there with all the people, the elders, the young people. They're even there with natives of the land, it says, and it's a peaceful gathering. Well, we don't know how that came about from the Bible, but in the Amarna letters, which were letters from Canaanite kings to the Egyptian pharaoh, some of them talk about this situation, and they accuse the king of Shechem as giving his land to these people they call the Habiru or the Apiru, which are a terminology that would be fitting for the Israelites at the time of the conquest. It wouldn't be exclusive to them, but it would certainly fit them as sort of outcasts and people coming in from the outside of the region.
Okay. Wow. Well, in your book, you note that as skepticism toward the Bible as a historically reliable document has increased, many scholars eventually began to claim that David was a fictitious king, since no ancient evidence has been discovered to corroborate his position as king or even his existence. But that began to change in 1993 during excavations at the ancient city of Dan. Tell us what was found.
In 93, they were excavating this courtyard area in front of the city gate, and it was made with all these paving stones. A lot of the stones that are used archaeologically in ancient times, they're reused often. So they were digging up a particular stone, and they noticed some writing on it, and there was this Aramean inscription. It was part of a broken stele, part of a broken victory stele. And on it, the Arameans were talking about their victory over the Israelites. And they list some Israelite kings, and then they say that they are from the house of David, indicating that David was the founder of the royal dynasty of Israelite kings. And so suddenly, this was the first ancient evidence of the existence of David and his position as the first king of this new Israelite dynasty. And things just changed almost overnight because of this. The Mesha Stele was reanalyzed and noted that it also contained this phrase, House of David, on it. And so now the debate really is not about whether or not David existed or was a king, but it centers more around how extensive was his kingdom and whether or not you believe that his palace has been discovered in Jerusalem.
Okay. Wow, fascinating. And it's amazing to think that all of these discoveries have really, maybe with a few exceptions, been found in the last, 150, 175 years? I mean, these are modern.
Most of them have been found in the last 100 years, really.
Wow.
100 to 120, except for a few exceptions.
So does that mean prior to that they weren't looking for these things, or archaeology hadn't really developed as a science per se?
Right. Archaeology really didn't exist before the 19th century. There were a few excavations from the 1700s, but it was a different process and very rare. So there was antiquarians were searching for ancient objects, but archaeology really was birthed in the 19th century, and the bulk of it has now been done in the 20th century and the early 21st century.
Okay. Well, chronologically, we now get to events recorded in the biblical book of Kings and Chronicles. You explain that the prevailing view about the accounts of the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah recorded in the Bible is that they were propaganda written by the official scribes of the kingdom of Judah. But do the archaeological sources from this time period tell a different story?
I think they do, absolutely. We have incredible attestation from this divided kingdom period where you have the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. We have most of the kings attested in various inscriptions from either other cultures or from Israel and Judah itself, as well as many of the events, the buildings, the different cities. So just to give a couple brief examples, we have the ivory house of Ahab that was discovered at his capital, Samaria, which the Bible talks about specifically. Talks about that capital, talks about the palace and his ivory house. We have things like the Mesha Stele, which I mentioned previously, but on this it's basically the Moabite version of 2 Kings chapter 3. So there are lots of names and locations and events there. We've got this connection between Hezekiah and Sennacherib and the whole Assyrian invasion that's really well attested at multiple archaeological sites and Assyrian inscriptions, as well as Judean inscriptions like Hezekiah's Boule. So really, really powerful evidence from this later time period.
Okay. And you said they went back to the Mesha Stele. When was that to reevaluate it?
That was after 93, after the Tel Dan Stele was discovered, and the phrase House of David was very clear. So on the Mesha Stele, there was a broken letter, and that's why it hadn't been so obvious, but they had the intact phrase, and on another document, so they went back and looked, and they could confirm that it was the same thing.
Okay. Well, you also highlight artifacts from the empires of Babylon and Persia, as well as the time of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, we'll cover the archaeological evidence for biblical accounts of Jesus in our next session together. But before we close this session, let's look at a few artifacts from the period of the New Testament, the first Christians and the early church. Tell us about the inscription detailing Paulus, the proconsul.
So there are 3 inscriptions that connect to Sergius Paulus. This is the governor of Cyprus that Paul and Barnabas met in Acts chapter 13. The first one, it was found north of the capital city, north of Paphos, and on it, it talks about this man, Paulus, the proconsul, or the governor, who was in power in Cyprus during the reign of Claudius. So that corroborates his existence and position there on Cyprus around the time that Paul visited. But then there's another inscription that was found in Rome, dates to about 47 AD, and Sergius Paulus has then gone back to Rome at this point, and he has a different position as a curator of the Tiber River. And then finally, there's another inscription that mentions him over in Asia Minor near the site of Pisidian Antioch, where his family home was. So we have 3 inscriptions about him, and we have one from right around the area where Paul went and initially met him.
Okay. Well, how does the Delphi inscription about Roman governor Gallio help to corroborate events in the biblical book of Acts?
Paul encounters Gallio at Corinth because Gallio served as the governor of Achaia province for a short time, and Corinth was the capital city there. Paul was brought before him in the middle of the forum at the Bema seat and talks about Gallio, the governor. Well, the Delphi inscription was discovered at Delphi. This is why that name is associated with it. And on this, it talks about the governor, Junius Gallio, the governor of Achaia, during the reign of the emperor Claudius. And so this helps us to actually situate Paul in Corinth right around 50 to 52 AD, because this inscription tells us the time when Gallio became governor. So not only does it help to confirm some of the people and situations in Acts, but it also helps us to pin a more definite chronology for the travels of Paul.
Okay. Obviously an essential figure in the Christian New Testament. Well, I think that's about all the time we'll have for this first session, Titus, but let's come back together for 2 more chats to discuss your more recent books, Excavating the Evidence for Jesus, and the newly published Essential Archaeological Guide to Biblical Lands. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Well, Titus's new book is now available. You can get it and his other books online from sources like Amazon, Barnes & Noble, or through Harvest House Publishers. Until next time, I'm Andrew McDiarmid. Thanks for tuning in.